Welcome back to Every Naval Battle in History. In episode 8, we take on one of the most famous naval battles of all, where the very existence of Athens hung in the balance. Salamis. We have covered the Ionian Revolt and the Battle of Artemisium in previous episodes. Do please check them out for the historic context of Salamis. Where we left off was in the aftermath of the spectacular stalemate of Artemisium, where both sides left in the warm glow of having achieved their objectives. The question was then which side was going to learn and grow from the episode. On the one side, we have an emperor, the inheritor of an empire, Xerxes. On the other side, we have the wily mariner, born outside of the aristocracy, the self-made Themistocles. Which of these two do you think is more capable of learning lessons from a victory? Sometime after the battles at sea and land, Artemisium and Thermopylae, the Greeks retreated south to the Isthmus of Corinth. The exact date is oddly unknown, the historians are silent. In some ways the Helm's Deep of ancient Greece, or perhaps more accurately Moat Cailin for the Game of Thrones fans watching. The Isthmus of Corinth is a narrow stretch of land joining the Peloponnese Peninsula with the rest of the mainland of Greece. In modern times there is a canal across it. The isthmus is just 6.3 kilometres wide. In preparation for the coming Persians, the roads had been torn up and a wall built. But there is no safety in walls if you surrender the sea. In withdrawing south of this barrier, the Athenians had surrendered their city completely, taking just what they could carry. Women and children driven south like refugees. The combined Greek fleet reformed in the Strait of Salamis, a sheltered body of water within sight of the Athenian port of Piraeus. When exactly did this happen? The historians are silent. Some theorise it was months after Artemisium, which gave time for both sides to recover their losses from that battle. Personally, I doubt the fireworks at Thermopylae, with the sacrifice of a Spartan king, would have taken place if the timetable to evacuate Athens had more than a few days in it. For a 3-day delay of the Persian army to be worth sacrificing so much, there can't have been much time to spare, in my view. The Persians are recorded as having, once again, 1,207 ships, 1,207. The same number they are supposed to have had at Artemisium, and the same number the Greeks apparently took with them to sack Troy. It is clear to me at this point that 1207 is just code for more than we can count. The Greeks probably had just over 370. As discussed before, the sources are vague as to the ships. The Greek forces are listed in detail, but not necessarily a reliable detail. Apparently there were 5 pentaconters, a warship with a single row of oarsmen, and the rest were triremes, with 3 rows. Athens made up 180 of the triremes, with 20 or so other Greek cities sending some number of ships. The Greek crews were, according to the Greek sources, less well-trained, and their ships were slower, but heavier than the Persians. If the Persians had been able to fight in open waters, it would have been carnage. Their faster ships getting around the sides of the Greeks, they probably could have won with equal numbers, let alone vastly outnumbering them as they did. This is where the human factor once again overwhelms the forces of history. The Persians were led by Xerxes, a man who had inherited the rule of an empire and who had little experience at sea. The Greeks were led by Themistocles, a self-made man from the lower classes and an experienced admiral. In any other battle, on any other day, in any other place, the Persians win this battle. Greece becomes part of the glorious empire, and the history of the world is very different from the one we know. But an inexperienced and arrogant emperor chose to attack the Greek fleet in their home waters. He chose to cram his superior sailing ships into narrow straits where they could use neither their maneuverability nor their numbers to overwhelm his opponent. And he chose to engage the heavier Greek ships in the head-on ramming engagement, which was the only situation in which they held an advantage. These things don't just happen. Despite notionally handing command of the combined fleet to the Spartan Eurybiades, due to the complex politics in which the Greeks specialise, Themistocles was not leaving it to chance. If Herodotus is to be believed, Themistocles sent a message to Xerxes saying he was on the king's side and prefers that your affairs prevail, not the Hellenes. Furthermore, the messenger told Xerxes that the Greek high command was fighting amongst itself. It was, but this is the usual state of affairs. and that if the Persians blocked the strait, the Greeks would probably surrender. Xerxes took the bait. He bought it hook, line and sinker. Looking at it from Xerxes' point of view, all his life people had been telling him they were on his side, and up until this point things had worked out pretty well for him. Also, the Greeks were always fighting amongst themselves, and it wasn't that long since the Battle of Lade, where the Persians had won after an entire wing of the Greek fleet had abandoned the battle. So the day of the battle dawns. Xerxes sets up his throne, we are told, on the summit of Mount Aigaleo. In a rarity for an ancient battle, this gives us a very good modern fix on the landscape. We know where the straits are, and we know where the mountain summit is. At over 10 kilometres from the straits, I wonder how much Xerxes could have actually seen. Apparently he thought the captains would compete to show off their heroic feats to him. One can only imagine that some huge signal flags were needed for him to be able to make out the positions. Having thrown away every advantage they had, the Persians crowded through the straits and into a meat grinder. The US Military Academy has produced a map of how they think the forces met in the strait. There are other guesses, but they're all just guesses. It must have been incredibly frustrating for the experienced mariners of the Persian fleet, particularly the Phoenicians and the Ionian Greeks, to be forced twice in a row, both at Artemisium and at Salamis, into the same awful frontal assaults against a fleet they could have mastered in any other sort of engagement. Xerxes' brother, Ariobaegus, was killed early in the battle. Artemisia, a female sea captain leading the Carian fleet, made a name for herself, firstly by telling Xerxes to his full face not to be such a fool before the battle. Having apparently done some damage to the Greeks, she decided to get the hell out of there and rammed a ship from her side, killing the king of the Calindians in the process. Xerxes, looking on from 11 kilometres distance, thought she'd rammed an Athenian ship and announced, "My men have become women, and my women men." The Athenians were so impressed with her efforts they thought she was on their side and let her go. Late in the day, shipwrecked Phoenician captains made it to Xerxes' throne, a good 2-hour walk from the straits, and complained that the Ionians had let them down. Xerxes apparently had them executed on the spot for slandering more noble men. It seems to me that Xerxes would have been looking for scapegoats at this point, having masterminded his own debacle. Diodorus wrote that Xerxes put to death those Phoenicians who were chiefly responsible for beginning the flight, and threatened to visit upon the rest the punishment they deserved. The Phoenicians, no doubt utterly sick of the whole stupid enterprise at this point, apparently sailed their ships home as soon as night fell. With no fleet, Xerxes couldn't bypass the Isthmus of Corinth. With no fleet, he couldn't keep his overwhelmingly large army supplied either. Xerxes withdrew, and while the Persians would menace Greece, and even sack Athens a second time, they would be defeated on land at the Battle of Plataea the next year. Salamis did not end the Greco-Persian Wars, but it did turn the tide. The destruction of the Persian fleet, and as importantly the splintering of the nations arrayed under the Persian banner, was a mortal blow to Persia's ability to project power away from its mainland. Incidentally, it is also said to mark the last battle in which a portion of the fleet was kept in reserve. Allowing your fleet to be destroyed in detail, piece by piece, by a concentrated enemy force, is not recommended to this day. More episodes to come. We've got a lot of ground to cover as we take on Every Naval Battle in History.